Welcome to this exploration of one of the most unsettling cases ever documented in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we proceed, I encourage you to share in the comments where you are tuning in from and the exact time you are hearing this narration. We are curious to learn which places and at what hours of the day or night these recorded accounts reach. During the autumn of 1892, the remote settlement of Black Hollow, nestled in the Missouri Ozarks, became the focal point of incidents that would confound even the most experienced investigators of that era. Located deep within the rugged landscape of Tenney County, this isolated community, home to no more than 40 individuals, adhered to rhythms established long before the Civil War ever reached their mountains. The hollow itself extended for roughly 3 miles between steep limestone bluffs, accessible solely by a narrow trail winding through dense forests of oak and hickory. Most inhabitants had never traveled beyond the nearest trading post in Forsyth, some 25 miles to the northeast, via treacherous mountain paths that claimed lives each winter. The geography of Black Hollow formed a natural fortress of solitude. Bull Creek meandered through the valley floor, nourished by countless springs emerging from the limestone bedrock. The water was so pure that travelers would deviate miles from established routes just to fill their vessels from these mountain sources. Yet this same isolation that provided life-sustaining water also fostered conditions where families could vanish without a trace, where secrets could simmer across generations, and where the boundary between civilization and wilderness grew progressively indistinct. Archaeological evidence indicated that various Native American groups had inhabited the hollow for centuries prior to European settlement. Creek and Cherokee hunting parties had utilized the extensive cave networks as seasonal shelters, leaving behind pictographs and artifacts that early settlers found both captivating and disconcerting. These ancient markings depicted scenes that appeared to document rituals and practices bearing no resemblance to the religious traditions familiar to Christian settlers. More troubling were the symbols that seemed to portray human figures undergoing transformations, their bodies stretched and distorted in ways that suggested either artistic symbolism or documentation of actual witnessed occurrences. At the heart of this community stood the Grimm family homestead, a weathered log structure built by Heinrich Grimm in 1847, when he first claimed the land under the provisions of the Federal Homestead Acts. Heinrich had arrived in the Ozarks as part of a wave of German immigration that brought skilled craftsmen and farmers to the frontier territories. He possessed knowledge of traditional European, folk medicine, and agricultural techniques that served him well in the challenging mountain environment. The original cabin he constructed demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of local building materials and climate conditions, incorporating features that would not become common in regional architecture for another generation. By 1892, the property had passed to his son Jacob Grimm, a man of 43 years, who resided there with his wife Martha and their 4 children: Samuel, aged 19, Rebecca, 17, young Heinrich, 12, and little Mary, just 8 years old. Jacob had inherited not only his father's land, but also his extensive knowledge of traditional medicine and his collection of books and manuscripts addressing subjects rarely discussed openly in frontier communities. The Grimm family library was unusual for such a remote location. Jacob possessed volumes on botany, anatomy, and natural philosophy that would have been considered advanced, even in established eastern cities. More intriguing were the handwritten journals and notebooks passed down through generations of the family. Documents containing detailed observations of local plant life, cave systems, and geological formations. These manuscripts revealed a level of systematic investigation and documentation suggesting the Grimms viewed their mountain home as more than merely a place to farm and raise livestock. Martha Grimm, born Martha Schneider, had grown up in a similar German immigrant family in the neighboring county. Her education was extensive for a frontier woman, including literacy in both German and English, basic mathematics, and comprehensive knowledge of herbal medicine and food preservation. She had married Jacob in 1870, and neighbors described the early years of their marriage as remarkably harmonious. Martha was known for her intelligence, her skill in treating injuries and illnesses, and her ability to predict weather patterns with uncanny accuracy. The four Grimm children had been raised with an unusual combination of practical frontier skills and scholarly pursuits. Samuel, the eldest, demonstrated remarkable ability in tracking and hunting, but also showed interest in his father's books and manuscripts. He had learned to read and write in both German and English, and he possessed knowledge of local geography that surpassed that of much older residents. Rebecca displayed similar intellectual gifts, but her interests focused more on botanical studies and the medicinal properties of native plants. Young Heinrich and Mary were still developing their individual characteristics, but both showed signs of the family's distinctive combination of practical skills and scholarly inclinations. Heinrich demonstrated unusual sensitivity to changes in weather and animal behavior, while Mary showed remarkable ability to locate water sources and navigate through dense forest without becoming lost. The Grimm family's reputation in Black Hollow was complex. They were respected for their knowledge and skills, frequently consulted when neighbors faced medical emergencies or agricultural problems. Yet there was also an undercurrent of unease about the family's activities and interests. They were known to spend considerable time exploring cave systems that other residents avoided, and they were rumored to possess knowledge of local history and geography that seemed to exceed what could be learned through normal observation and experience. The first indication that something was amiss came on October 15, 1892, when Samuel Grimm failed to return from checking the family's trap lines along Roar Creek. The boy had left before dawn, as was his custom, carrying his father's old percussion rifle and a small canvas sack for any game he might find. He had also taken with him a leather-bound notebook, in which he recorded observations about animal behavior and weather patterns. This notebook would later prove to be one of the few tangible clues to his fate. When darkness fell and he had not returned, Jacob organized a search party with 3 neighboring families: the Kellys, the Hoffmans, and the Mlouds. These were experienced woodsmen who knew every trail and landmark within a 15-mile radius of the hollow. The search began immediately, despite the difficulty of navigating the rough terrain in darkness. Torches and lanterns were gathered, and the men spread out in a systematic pattern, designed to cover the most likely route Samuel would have taken. They found Samuel's rifle beside the creek, its barrel submerged in the shallow water. The weapon showed no signs of damage or struggle, and it remained loaded with the original charge Jacob had prepared earlier that morning. His canvas sack lay nearby, torn and empty. But the tear pattern suggested deliberate cutting rather than accidental damage. Most disturbing of all was the complete absence of his notebook, which Samuel never traveled without, and which would have been valuable to anyone familiar with its contents. The tracks discovered in the soft mud along the bank defied easy explanation and would be discussed and debated by residents of the hollow for decades to come. Samuel's boot prints were clearly visible in several locations, showing that he had moved along the creek bank for some distance before stopping at the spot where his rifle was found. But alongside his tracks were impressions that challenged the observer's understanding of what they were seeing. Old Thomas Kelly, who had tracked game through these mountains for over 50 years, later told the county sheriff that the accompanying prints appeared to be made by bare feet, but of unusual size and proportion. The impressions suggested feet that were longer and narrower than normal, with what appeared to be unusually extended toes. The depth of the impressions indicated someone of considerable weight, perhaps 200 pounds or more. Yet the stride length and gait pattern suggested a much smaller individual. More puzzling still was the discovery of additional print types that seemed to indicate the presence of multiple individuals. Some impressions appeared completely normal, suggesting the involvement of at least one person of conventional build and gait. Others showed characteristics that the experienced trackers found impossible to categorize. The arrangement of the various tracks suggested a meeting or gathering had taken place at the creek side, with Samuel's movements indicating he had approached willingly rather than under duress. The search continued for 3 days, with the initial party expanding to include men from as far away as Branson and Hollister. They found scraps of Samuel's clothing caught on thorny underbrush nearly 2 miles from where his rifle was discovered. But the fabric showed no signs of violence or struggle. Instead, the tears appeared to be the result of rapid movement through dense vegetation, as if Samuel had been running or moving quickly through areas where normal travel would require careful navigation. The trail of fabric scraps led toward the most remote and difficult terrain in the region, areas where even experienced hunters rarely ventured due to the dangerous combination of steep cliffs, unstable rock formations, and cave systems that could easily trap the unwary. The final piece of Samuel's clothing was found at the base of a sheer rock face that rose nearly 100 feet above Roar Creek in a location that seemed impossible to reach without specialized climbing equipment. During this period of intensive searching, the behavior of the Grimm family members drew considerable attention from their neighbors and the volunteers who had come to help. While such situations typically brought out strong emotional reactions from family members, the Grimms displayed responses that struck many observers as unusual and troubling. Martha Grimm exhibited behavior that ranged from unnaturally calm to almost detached from the crisis at hand. While other mothers in similar circumstances might have been consumed with grief, anxiety, or frantic activity, she maintained her daily routines with mechanical precision. She continued to prepare meals for the search parties, tend to household tasks, and care for her remaining children as if nothing extraordinary was happening. When directly questioned about Samuel's disappearance, she spoke of him as if he were merely delayed rather than missing, expressing confidence that he would return when his current activities were completed. More disturbing to the search volunteers were Martha's references to knowledge about Samuel's whereabouts that she claimed to have received through dreams and visions. She spoke of communication with her son that occurred during sleep, describing conversations in which he assured her of his safety and explained that he was engaged in important work that prevented his immediate return. These claims were initially dismissed as the wishful thinking of a worried mother, but Martha's detailed descriptions of locations and activities proved remarkably accurate in several instances. When Sheriff Henry Coulson arrived from the county seat in Forsyth, he found a situation that challenged his experience with frontier crises and family emergencies. Sheriff Coulson was a veteran lawman who had dealt with numerous cases of missing persons, domestic violence, and wilderness accidents during his 15 years in office. He prided himself on his ability to quickly assess situations and determine the most likely explanations for unusual events. His interview with Martha Grimm left him profoundly unsettled. Her responses to his questions were measured, detailed, and internally consistent, but they described a version of events that seemed to exist in a different reality from that experienced by other family members and neighbors. She claimed that Samuel had been preparing for this disappearance for several weeks, gathering supplies and information for what she described as an important journey of discovery. She insisted that his absence was voluntary and purposeful, rather than the result of accident or foul play. More troubling were Martha's references to Samuel's involvement in activities that she described as continuing the work begun by previous inhabitants of the region. She spoke of ancient knowledge preserved in the cave systems of the Hollow, information that had been passed down through generations of people who understood the true nature of the mountain environment. According to Martha, Samuel had demonstrated unusual sensitivity to this hidden knowledge and had been selected to play a role in preserving and extending it. Sheriff Coulson's attempts to obtain more specific information about these claims proved frustrating. Martha's explanations were detailed and consistent, but they referred to concepts and activities that seemed to have no basis in observable reality. She spoke of communication networks that operated without conventional means, of knowledge that could be transmitted directly from mind to mind, and of discoveries that had been made in the hidden chambers beneath the mountains. The sheriff's interviews with the other Grimm family members revealed additional disturbing information about the household's dynamics and Samuel's behavior. In the weeks before his disappearance, Rebecca, the eldest daughter, confided that Samuel had been troubled by strange dreams and visions that began sometime in late August. He had spoken of hearing voices calling to him from the deep woods, voices that seemed to know intimate details about his life and family history. These voices, according to Rebecca's account, had provided Samuel with detailed information about the cave systems in the region, including the locations of chambers and passages that were not marked on any available maps. Samuel had begun making solitary expeditions into these underground areas, returning with artifacts and specimens that he claimed proved the existence of previous inhabitants, whose knowledge and capabilities exceeded those of current settlers. Young Heinrich, despite his youth, provided additional insights into his brother's changing behavior and interests. He reported that Samuel had begun speaking in a language that no one in the family recognized, carrying on extended conversations with individuals who were not visible to other family members. These conversations appeared to be exchanges of information rather than simple expressions of mental disturbance, with Samuel asking questions and apparently receiving detailed answers about subjects ranging from local history to advanced techniques of agriculture and medicine. The boy also described finding Samuel in various locations around the family property at unusual hours, often standing motionless in positions that suggested he was listening intently to sounds that others could not hear. On several occasions, Heinrich had followed his brother into the forest, watching as Samuel navigated directly to specific locations without reference to trails or landmarks, moving with confidence through terrain that would have challenged experienced woodsmen. Jacob Grimm's responses to questioning proved equally disturbing, though in different ways from those of his wife. Unlike Martha's calm certainty about Samuel's safety and purpose, Jacob displayed signs of deep anxiety and confusion about his son's disappearance. He acknowledged that Samuel had been acting strangely in recent weeks, but he attributed these changes to the normal stresses of growing up in an isolated environment rather than to any supernatural or unexplained influences. More significantly, Jacob admitted to Sheriff Coulson that the family possessed extensive written records about the history and geography of Black Hollow, information that had been compiled over several generations by various residents and previous inhabitants of the region. These documents, according to Jacob, contained detailed maps of cave systems, descriptions of artifacts and markings found in underground chambers, and accounts of unusual events and phenomena that had occurred in the area over a period of more than a century. Jacob's reluctance to share these documents with the investigation troubled Sheriff Coulson, but the sheriff lacked legal authority to demand access to private family papers without evidence of criminal activity. Jacob insisted that the materials were fragile and potentially dangerous if misinterpreted, and he expressed concern that making them public could lead to treasure hunting and vandalism that would damage important historical sites. The search for Samuel was officially called off on October 19th after 4 days of intensive effort by more than 30 volunteers. The decision was based on the practical reality that the available resources had been exhausted and that further searching would require equipment and expertise that were not available in the region. Sheriff Coulson filed a formal missing person report and requested assistance from federal authorities. But the remote location and limited evidence made it unlikely that additional resources would be allocated to the case. Jacob Grimm accepted the end of the official search with a stoicism that impressed some observers and disturbed others. He expressed gratitude to the volunteers who had participated and acknowledged the thorough nature of their efforts, but he showed no signs of the desperation or continuing hope that might be expected from a father in such circumstances. Instead, he spoke of accepting God's will and of trusting that Samuel's fate would ultimately be revealed according to divine timing. As autumn deepened into winter, the Grimm household settled into routines that reflected the absence of their eldest son, but also suggested a level of preparation and acceptance that seemed inconsistent with the unexpected nature of his disappearance. Samuel's responsibilities were redistributed among the remaining family members with an efficiency that suggested prior planning, and the family's daily activities continued with minimal disruption. Martha Grimm's behavior during this period became the subject of considerable discussion among the residents of Black Hollow. She began taking long walks alone into the same areas where Samuel had disappeared, often remaining away from the cabin for hours at a time. When questioned about these excursions, she explained that she found peace and clarity in the forest environment and that her walks helped her maintain spiritual connection with her missing son. These solitary journeys took Martha into terrain that even experienced hunters approached with caution. She demonstrated familiarity with cave entrances and underground passages that were not marked on available maps, and she showed knowledge of local geography that exceeded what could have been gained through casual exploration. Neighbors who encountered her during these walks reported that she moved through the difficult terrain with confidence and purpose, following routes that seemed to have been carefully planned in advance. More troubling were reports that Martha had been observed in locations and at times that seemed impossible given the distances involved and the challenging nature of the terrain. Multiple witnesses claimed to have seen her simultaneously in different parts of the hollow, leading to speculation about whether she was receiving assistance from unknown accomplices or whether the observers had been mistaken in their identification. Rebecca Grimm, now the eldest child remaining at home, assumed many of her mother's domestic responsibilities with a maturity that seemed to exceed her 17 years. Neighbors noted that she had developed a serious, almost haunted expression that replaced her former youthful enthusiasm and curiosity about the world beyond Black Hollow. She rarely spoke unless directly addressed, and she began avoiding social gatherings and community activities that had previously brought her enjoyment. The girl's transformation was particularly evident in her relationship with the natural environment around the family homestead. Previously, Rebecca had enjoyed exploring the woods and fields near the cabin, collecting specimens for botanical studies, and helping with outdoor work. After Samuel's disappearance, however, she seemed to develop an aversion to venturing far from the immediate vicinity of the house, and she showed signs of anxiety when required to travel even short distances into the forest. Young Heinrich and Mary displayed their own troubling adaptations to the changed circumstances of their family life. Heinrich became increasingly prone to violent outbursts, striking his sister or destroying household items with little apparent provocation. These episodes were followed by periods of complete withdrawal during which he would remain silent and unresponsive for hours at a time. The boy also began showing signs of the unusual sensitivity to environmental conditions that had characterized Samuel's behavior, predicting weather changes and animal behavior with accuracy that exceeded normal childhood intuition. Mary, the youngest at 8 years old, underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation of any family member. Previously known as a chatty and curious child who delighted in asking questions and exploring her surroundings, she became silent and withdrawn, often found staring out the cabin windows toward the tree line for extended periods. When she did speak, her comments often referred to conversations she claimed to have with Samuel, describing detailed exchanges that suggested ongoing contact with her missing brother. Winter in the Ozarks during 1892-93 proved particularly harsh, with heavy snows that began in late November and continued intermittently through March. The isolation that was already a defining characteristic of Black Hollow became complete as the mountain passes became impassable and communication with the outside world was reduced to occasional visits by the most determined travelers. Families were forced to rely entirely on their stored provisions, preserved foods, and whatever hunting and trapping could be accomplished despite the severe weather conditions. It was during this period of enforced isolation that the most disturbing events began to unfold within the Grimm household. The first indication of serious problems came in late December, just days before Christmas, when Heinrich burst into the cabin of their nearest neighbors, the Kellys, in a state of complete hysteria. The boy was barely clothed despite the bitter cold, his feet bloody from running barefoot through snow that was more than a foot deep in most areas. Heinrich's account of conditions at his family's cabin was fragmented and difficult to follow, but certain details were consistent and deeply troubling. He claimed that his mother had been undergoing some kind of transformation that made her increasingly unrecognizable as the person he had known throughout his childhood. According to the boy, Martha spent most of her time in activities that he could not understand or explain, speaking in languages that none of the family members recognized and performing tasks that seemed to serve no practical purpose. More distressing were Heinrich's descriptions of his father's response to these changes. Jacob had apparently become so disturbed by his wife's behavior that he had taken to sleeping in the root cellar beneath the cabin, emerging only when absolutely necessary for essential tasks such as caring for the livestock or gathering firewood. The boy described his father as existing in a state of constant fear, convinced that the woman living in their cabin was no longer his wife, but some kind of imposter or possessed individual. Thomas Kelly and his adult son, William immediately accompanied Heinrich back to the Grimm homestead. Despite the dangerous conditions and their own concerns about what they might encounter there, the journey through the deep snow required more than an hour, and they arrived at the cabin as darkness was beginning to fall. The scene they encountered there would be remembered and discussed by both men for the remainder of their lives. The exterior of the cabin appeared entirely normal, with smoke rising peacefully from the chimney and no obvious signs of disturbance or violence. However, the interior of the building told a dramatically different story that challenged the visitors' understanding of what they were witnessing. The main living area had been completely rearranged, with furniture moved into positions that served no apparent practical purpose. Items that had previously been stored in logical locations were now distributed throughout the room, according to patterns that seemed to follow some kind of organizational system that the visitors could not comprehend. More disturbing were the various objects and materials that had been added to the room since the Kellys' last visit to the household. Glass containers filled with plant materials and unidentifiable liquids were arranged on every available surface, each carefully labeled with symbols that bore no resemblance to any writing system familiar to the visitors. Bundles of dried herbs and roots hung from the rafters, creating a complex network of organic materials that filled the air with strong, unfamiliar scents. Martha Grimm sat in her rocking chair by the fire, but her appearance was so dramatically altered that the Kellys initially failed to recognize her as the woman they had known for more than 20 years. She had lost a considerable amount of weight, her clothes hanging loosely on a frame that seemed to have physically diminished in size. Her hair, once a rich brown and carefully maintained, had grown wild and unkempt, streaked with premature gray that made her appear decades older than her actual age. Most disturbing were the changes in her eyes and facial expression. Martha's gaze had taken on an intensity that made direct eye contact extremely uncomfortable, and her facial features seemed somehow sharpened and more angular than before. When she acknowledged the visitors, her voice had acquired a different quality, with pronunciation and inflection that suggested she was speaking English as a second language rather than the native tongue she had used throughout her life in the Hollow. She greeted Thomas and William Kelly by name, but her manner suggested that she was drawing upon memories of their relationship rather than experiencing genuine recognition or emotional connection. When asked about her family's circumstances and Heinrich's distressed condition, she provided answers that were factually accurate, but delivered with a detachment that seemed inconsistent with normal parental concern. More troubling still were her references to Samuel's continuing presence in the household. Martha spoke of her missing son as if he were physically present, describing recent conversations and shared activities as if his disappearance had never occurred. When the Kellys attempted to remind her that Samuel had been missing for more than 2 months, she acknowledged their concern, but insisted that their perception of the situation was based on incomplete information about the true nature of human consciousness and communication. When Thomas Kelly asked about Jacob's whereabouts, Martha simply pointed toward the floor, indicating the root cellar beneath the cabin. The visitors found Jacob Grimm huddled among the stored vegetables and preserved meats, wrapped in blankets and shivering, despite the relatively warm temperature of the underground space. The man they discovered bore little resemblance to the confident, capable farmer they had known for years. Jacob's physical condition suggested that he had been living in the cellar for an extended period, surviving on stored food and water that Rebecca brought down to him through a system of ropes and baskets. His hair had turned completely white, and his hands trembled with what might have been cold fear or some combination of both conditions. Most significantly, he seemed to have aged years in the span of months, his face marked by deep lines and an expression of perpetual anxiety. Jacob's explanation of his living situation made little coherent sense to his visitors, but his terror was genuine and profound. He claimed that the woman living above them in the cabin was no longer his wife, but some kind of replacement or transformed version of Martha, who possessed knowledge and capabilities that no normal human being could have acquired. He spoke of hearing her conducting conversations with multiple individuals during the night, despite the fact that no visitors had been observed coming or going from the isolated homestead. More disturbing were Jacob's accounts of discovering evidence that Martha was conducting activities that seemed to require knowledge of chemistry, botany, and other subjects that she had never studied. He described finding complex apparatus and materials that appeared to be related to some kind of systematic research or experimentation. Work that was being conducted according to principles and procedures that exceeded his understanding. Jacob also reported that Martha had begun demonstrating abilities that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. She appeared to know about events occurring in distant locations without access to information through conventional means, and she showed familiarity with the extensive cave systems beneath Black Hollow that could only have been acquired through years of systematic exploration. Most troubling of all, she seemed to be in communication with individuals who were not physically present, conducting detailed conversations that suggested access to sources of knowledge that existed outside the normal boundaries of human experience. The Kellys attempted to persuade both Jacob and Martha to accept assistance from the community, but neither seemed capable of acknowledging that their situation was abnormal or problematic. Jacob insisted that he was safer in the root cellar, and that any attempt to interfere with Martha's activities would result in consequences that he could not adequately describe. Martha acknowledged their concern, but maintained that their perception of the situation was based on misunderstanding about the nature of her current work and responsibilities. Young Rebecca could be observed occasionally peering around corners and moving through the shadows of the cabin, but she avoided direct contact with the visitors and seemed to exist in a state of constant anxiety about her family's circumstances. When Thomas Kelly attempted to speak with her directly, she fled to areas of the cabin where the visitors could not follow, suggesting that she had been instructed to avoid contact with outsiders. Most mysterious of all was the complete absence of young Mary, who could not be located despite thorough searching of the cabin and immediate vicinity. When asked about the child's whereabouts, Martha provided vague responses that suggested Mary was safe and well cared for, but occupied with activities that required privacy and concentration. Jacob, when questioned separately, admitted that he had not seen his youngest daughter for several weeks and expressed profound concern about her fate. Disturbed by what they had witnessed, the Kellys convinced Heinrich to return with them to their own cabin where he could be properly fed and cared for while they determined what action to take regarding his family situation. The boy proved to be their primary source of information about the deteriorating conditions in the Grimm household, though his accounts were often so disturbing that the adults found them difficult to believe or accept. According to Heinrich, the changes in his mother had begun gradually in the weeks following Samuel's disappearance, but had accelerated dramatically as winter deepened and the family's isolation became complete. Martha had started spending increasing amounts of time studying the collection of books and manuscripts that had been passed down through generations of the Grimm family, focusing particularly on materials that dealt with subjects related to natural history, geology, and what Heinrich described as underground knowledge. The boy reported that Martha had begun making regular expeditions into cave systems that were located within walking distance of the family homestead, returning with various materials and specimens that she processed and stored according to procedures that seemed to follow systematic, scientific principles. These activities were conducted primarily during daylight hours while the children were occupied with their own responsibilities. But Heinrich had occasionally observed his mother's work from concealed positions. More troubling were Heinrich's accounts of nighttime activities that he had witnessed from his sleeping area in the cabin's loft. He claimed that Martha regularly left the cabin after the family was supposed to be asleep, remaining away for hours at a time. Despite the dangerous winter conditions and the complete darkness that prevailed in the hollow during the long winter nights, on several occasions, he had observed his mother's departure and returned through the small window near his bed, noting that she moved through the difficult terrain with confidence that suggested extensive familiarity with routes that would challenge even experienced outdoorsmen during daylight hours. Even more disturbing were Heinrich's claims about visitors to the cabin during the night hours. He reported seeing figures approaching the homestead after dark, individuals who moved through the snow without leaving the deep tracks that would normally be expected. These visitors appeared to communicate with Martha through methods that did not involve normal speech, and their meetings sometimes continued for hours before they departed, as silently as they had arrived. The boy's descriptions of these mysterious visitors were fragmented and inconsistent, but certain details appeared repeatedly in his accounts. He described individuals who seemed to be unusually tall and thin, who moved with a gliding motion that did not appear entirely natural, and who wore clothing that provided no apparent protection against the severe winter weather, yet seemed unaffected by the cold conditions. Most significantly, Heinrich claimed that these visitors brought with them various items that Martha incorporated into her ongoing activities and experiments. He described seeing boxes, containers, and wrapped packages that were exchanged during these nighttime meetings, materials that were later stored in areas of the cabin and root cellar that had been designated for Martha's exclusive use. The Kellys were faced with a dilemma that was common to isolated frontier communities, but nonetheless challenging to resolve satisfactorily. The nearest law enforcement was located in Forsyth, more than 25 miles away through mountain terrain that was essentially impassable during winter conditions. Moreover, they were uncertain whether any laws were being violated by the strange behavior they had witnessed. A woman conducting unusual experiments and a man hiding in his root cellar might represent a domestic crisis, but they hardly constituted clear evidence of criminal activity. The mysterious nighttime visitors could be explained as neighbors providing assistance or conducting trade that was kept private for personal reasons. Even the dramatic changes in Martha's appearance and behavior might be attributed to the stress of losing a child and the hardships of frontier life during a particularly severe winter. After considerable discussion, the Kellys decided to seek guidance from Reverend Isaiah Morris, a circuit preacher who made regular rounds through the region and was scheduled to visit Black Hollow during the third week of January. Reverend Morris had dealt with similar situations in other remote communities and possessed both the authority and experience necessary to determine appropriate courses of action. In the meantime, they agreed to provide care for Heinrich and to monitor the situation at the Grimm homestead as closely as possible given the weather conditions and the family's apparent desire for privacy. They also sent word to other families in the hollow requesting that they remain alert for any signs of additional problems or emergency situations that might require community response. The weeks that followed proved to be among the most difficult and disturbing in the memory of Black Hollow's longtime residents. The severe weather continued, making travel and communication extremely hazardous, but reports began to circulate about unusual activities and phenomena that seemed to center around the general area of the Grimm property. Several neighbors reported seeing lights moving through the forest during the nighttime hours, illumination that appeared too bright and too consistent to be explained by torches or lanterns. These lights seemed to follow regular patterns, moving along routes that connected various cave entrances and other significant geographical features in the region. The lights were observed on multiple nights by different families, suggesting systematic activity rather than random or accidental phenomena. More disturbing were reports of sounds echoing through the hollow during the early morning hours, particularly in the time just before dawn. These sounds were described as resembling human voices, but speaking in languages that none of the listeners could identify. The voices seemed to carry clearly through the winter air, despite apparent distances that should have made such communication impossible, and they sometimes continued for hours at a time. Thomas Kelly, who possessed the most extensive knowledge of local wildlife and natural phenomena, investigated these reports as thoroughly as conditions permitted. His observations confirmed that the sounds were not produced by any known animal species in the region, and their characteristics suggested human vocal cords producing organized speech patterns. However, the acoustic properties of the sounds indicated that they were originating from locations that seemed impossible to reach during winter conditions. Additional disturbing evidence came from tracking expeditions that several residents attempted during brief periods when weather conditions permitted safe travel. The snow cover that blanketed the hollow throughout the winter months should have preserved clear evidence of any movement through the area. Yet the tracks that were discovered defied easy interpretation. Numerous paths through the snow showed evidence of regular use by multiple individuals. Yet these routes connected areas that were separated by terrain features that should have made travel extremely difficult or impossible. More puzzling still, the footprint impressions showed characteristics that seemed inconsistent with any known types of footwear or foot coverings used by local residents. Some tracks appeared to have been made by individuals who were barefoot despite the freezing temperatures, while others suggested footwear that was larger and differently shaped than any boots or shoes familiar to local residents. Most troubling were impressions that seemed to show individuals moving across snow-covered terrain without sinking to the depth that would be expected given the soft, powdery nature of the snow cover. When Reverend Isaiah Morris finally arrived in Black Hollow on January 18, 1893, he found a community that was struggling to make sense of events that seemed to challenge their understanding of normal human behavior and natural phenomena. Reverend Morris was a man of considerable education and experience, having served frontier communities throughout Missouri and Arkansas for more than 15 years. He had dealt with cases involving mental illness, domestic violence, and various forms of religious extremism, and he was not easily disturbed by unusual circumstances or behavior. His initial meeting with the community leaders and the Kelly family provided him with a comprehensive overview of the situation, but he insisted on conducting his own independent investigation before drawing any conclusions about appropriate courses of action. His first priority was to interview Heinrich directly, both to assess the boy's mental and physical condition, and to obtain first-hand accounts of the events he had witnessed. Heinrich's testimony to Reverend Morris was detailed, consistent, and deeply disturbing. The boy described a systematic transformation of his family that had begun shortly after Samuel's disappearance and had accelerated throughout the winter months. According to his account, this transformation involved not only changes in behavior and appearance, but also the acquisition of knowledge and capabilities that seemed to exceed normal human limitations. The Reverend was particularly troubled by Heinrich's descriptions of his mother's activities and the apparent sources of the information and material she was using in her work. The boy claimed that Martha had gained access to written records and documents that contained detailed information about the history and geography of Black Hollow, materials that seemed to have been created by previous inhabitants of the region whose identity and fate remained unknown. These documents, according to Heinrich, included maps of cave systems that extended far beyond what had been explored by current residents, along with detailed descriptions of chambers and passages that contained artifacts and markings left by earlier occupants. More significantly, the materials apparently provided instructions for various procedures and experiments that Martha was attempting to implement using local plants and minerals. Heinrich also described his mother's apparent ability to communicate with individuals who were not physically present, conducting extended conversations that seemed to involve the exchange of complex information about subjects ranging from local history to advanced techniques of medicine and chemistry. These communications appeared to occur both during Martha's solitary expeditions into the cave systems and during the nighttime meetings with mysterious visitors that the boy had observed from his concealed vantage point in the cabin's loft. Reverend Morris's second priority was to attempt direct communication with the Grimm family members, particularly Martha and Jacob. This proved to be more challenging than he had anticipated, as neither individual seemed willing or able to engage in conventional social interaction. Martha acknowledged his presence and his role as a religious authority, but her responses to his questions and counseling attempts suggested that she viewed their conversation from a perspective that differed fundamentally from normal human relationships and concerns.